start painting an image and start painting your environment. And we'll discuss one of those ways in this chapter. We'll start with blocking out colors in our image, and for that I've created a sketch to help myself with perspective and basically a construction of what I would want to have out there. Obviously, you don't have to have that sketch in order to create an environment concept like this. This sketch, however, will help you to get the essence and get the perspective correctly, especially when you're learning and you're at the stage of understanding perspective and blocking out shapes with colors. Having a sketch like this will make it much easier, and it doesn't take too much time to sketch something like that. It took me literally about 5 minutes to get all those lines in, and it shouldn't take you more than that. Those lines don't have to be very clean or anything like that. They only suggest what kind of shapes you're going to be working with, and this will make your job and further works a little much easier than if you would have to work just directly from picking colors and putting colors and putting the blocks of colors in your canvas. So let's look at some of the references. Let's look at what is a hero reference and how to search for references and what to look for, and then how to pick colors and then start blocking colors. The first thing I usually like to do is to examine something called, or something I call specifically, a hero reference. A hero reference in my mind would be a reference that would pretty much define exactly what you want to create. Obviously, you can sketch out your ideas first, and whether you're going to use line art or values, those sketches will define exactly what you want. And this is exactly what we did right here with this sketch. I've sketched out the idea I wanted to create in the first place so that I have an original concept to work with. However, the hero reference is something that will define the lighting, something that will define a color palette for you, or maybe just influence how the lighting and color is going to act in your final concept, in your final color concept. There are many steps that lead from here to finished piece, and those steps can interchange. They can be skipped. There is a few ways, or actually many ways in which you can create a final concept art. We'll discuss a way that probably is one of the efficient ones, but also allows you to approach your images in a very informed way, where you have a lot of control over what you do and a lot of control over how the image is going to turn out in the end. There's a few other techniques that are much faster than this technique. However, those techniques have some caveats, and the biggest caveat is a lack of control over what you're gonna see in the final image. The reason I'm going to discuss this technique mostly in this course is because once you master how to work that way, you'll find out that other techniques, such as starting just from photography and expanding the photography with your concept ideas, or starting with 3D elements and all that stuff, will become much easier because you'll have a foundation understanding how to block colors, how to use those colors to your advantage, what colors to look for, and whatnot. All right, so let's start talking about colors here. We have a little reference here that I'm going to use as my hero reference. This is a construction that has a Rococo style, architectural style, and I want my concept to have a little bit of that Rococo influence. However, what I'm going to paint is going to be sort of a mix of that timepiece, that history piece, together with something that could be low science fiction, perhaps maybe something that could belong to space opera, or even if you change the color palette and maybe make it darker or anything like that, it could be even a cyberpunk reality. However, for me, it's going to be adventurous, almost in the Indiana Jones style painting, in which we'll have more of a sci-fi approach to the architecture and the environment with some elements of fantasy. So it's not gonna feel like a historical piece, nor will it feel as a typically sci-fi piece. So for that, we have obviously our sketch and we have our hero reference. Now what I've created here is a bunch of swatches on the side. Obviously you can see there's color blending done between those. The reason I've created this is just to show you what kind of color palette this image generally has by pulling the colors from the most important parts. So if we go here and create a new layer for just a second, I'll pick this red color just so that you know which bracket is referencing to which area. This mural or this wall texture, wall color is this color right here, this little bracket. This bracket that is a little longer and wider and more rich in terms of how green it is. This is actually a color that comes from the vegetation. So I'm using that to grab more or less what range of values and what range of hues the vegetation is going to have. This color is obviously sky, which we could just make an arrow like this. This is going from the sand, and this whole bracket is all the gold elements that you see in the picture, so we could make a arrow like this. Let's just turn all of those into arrows so that we know exactly when you look at this diagram, this dirty diagram, what's coming from where. So once you have that information, then you can start working and start to pick the colors apart and figure out, okay, what kind of composition I'm going to create, what kind of color palette I'm going to work with, how will I change this color palette, do I need to change this color palette, or will I keep it as close to the photography as possible. What I will suggest when you start is to keep the color palette as close to original as possible, as close to realistic colors as you can. The reason is very simple. It's much easier to go from color palette that is natural and realistic to stylized and, analogous, for instance. Reason being is that once you have all the natural colors in your painting with the correct lighting and correct material read and everything like that, it's going to be super easy to do any kinds of color corrections on top of that. Otherwise, if you start with a color corrected image, and that was one of the points I've mentioned earlier, try avoiding color corrected images because they don't represent the correct lighting, the correct colors, and how lighting behaves in the photography. When you don't have a correct lighting, it's extremely hard to change the lighting in the scene. It's extremely hard to change the color palette in the scene. From here, when you have a photo that has more or less a naturalistic look, obviously what I've noticed here is probably the saturation or maybe the vibrance of this whole photo should be slightly lower, but not too much. This is probably what the color would look like in real life. Not too much of a saturation change. I don't believe this is a heavily post-processed photography. If anything, there's maybe a little bit more of a saturation than in reality, but then again, it all depends on our own eyes. Each of us have a different set of eyes, and our eyes see the world slightly different. So for me, it's a little bit too saturated. For you, it can be right about the right saturation. So I'm not gonna edit anything here, just suggesting that this could be a situation. But it doesn't seem to be a image that is heavily post-processed. It is very naturalistic, very realistic looking photography. And that's what I would be looking for when I look for my references. I also have gathered a couple of other references before I start painting, which are those here. And those are related to the architectural style, but some of them aren't. And the reason why they aren't is very simple. For instance, we have those two, or actually three images. This is a church image built out of wood. We also have another church image with a cemetery with some trees around them. A image of what I believe to be a school, or an older house, and a very interesting color palette that is very similar to color palette of this. Only few changes are in there, and maybe a little bit of lighting, because this seems to be a late afternoon, whereas this is more of a midday, noon almost scenario. Also, we have this image of ruins, of more of a church that looks to be more of a Gothic style, and then there's this nice looking windows here with an interesting roofing, and obviously an interior of a Rococo style residence. So why did I choose those images in the first place? The reason for this kind of choice is very simple. Obviously, we have our hero image from which we will choose the most of what we need to have. But I've also decided to choose an interior image because I particularly like the way those columns, or those very square-like columns, look like. The detail that you have on the door and the door frame, also the detail that you see here on those capitals. Those are all very interesting elements that I want to have in my reference. Also, when you look at this frame that frames this nice painting in here with the flowers, you can see that there are golden sort of painted elements that we would want to use, or I will want to use in my image. All those flowery looking ornaments here on the window frames, all of those small things that I feel have a nice value and have a nice interesting ideas in them. When you go back to our sketch right here, you can see that I've sketched out those little lines on those columns right here, on those parts of the wall, and you can see that this is basically an implication that I want to have that little detail right in there. So that's why I've chosen this reference in the first place. Now, all the other references, especially those three at the bottom and this one right here, all of them are chosen specifically for vegetation and the ground texture. I want to have a good understanding of how grass and dirt looks like when it's untouched, or maybe slightly trimmed, and have a sort of a good feeling, like how can I use that, and where can I use that in my image, if I can use it at all. Maybe I'll find that some of the references I've chosen might not necessarily be useful for the painting I'll be doing. And finally, those windows. I figured this is a very nice looking style. This reminds me a little bit of a Rococo style. I might be wrong. This is an image pulled directly from the internet, so I haven't done research what kind of style this is. But looking at those window frames from this particular image, I can see similarities, and obviously, to me, it just gives me an indication that it's either Renaissance or a Rococo style. It's definitely not a Baroque style, because it's a very very simplistic and very delicate, rather than bold and asymmetrical. So again, this is a great reference for what I want to achieve, especially in this little window frame that I have here. So my concept that I will be working from here is sort of a mixture of different architectural styles with a heavier influence of Rococo, a mix of a fantasy and sci-fi, something that kind of connects all the worlds together in an interesting concept. I want to have it as a daylight scenario with a sort of pastel colors that will populate the walls themselves, and and a little bit of use of that texture, the golden texture, into the ornaments. So let's get going. Before we go into actual painting, I want also to talk about color picking and practices that I use personally and that I advise you to use when in production, versus practices that you would probably want to use when you're training, when you're experimenting, learning, and practicing just for yourself, where you don't have a time limitations, you don't have expectations from the client or from the studio. You are on your own clock and you can spend how much time as you want. There's few things to discuss here. There's painting from nature, plein air, and painting from photography. The truth of the matter is that majority of artists use references of any kind in order to create realism. I don't personally know any artist that can paint realistically just from head. Almost every artist I know use references, in whether it's just in a very minimal way to get the lighting scheme, or just to sort of remind himself or herself what the colors are, or how those things look. Painting from references is just basically very obvious and very natural way of working. Now, there's two ways in which you can work with color. One is picking the color by yourself, which means if we want to start painting right here, we have our sketch and we'll create a new layer. And if you want to paint, let's say, this green color first, we go to the color picker and then start finding that right color. And you can go as close as this. This is obviously very easy because then you can compare this little box with the color that we see here and sort of eyeball it and find something that looks very similar to what you see in here. Probably something like this would be very close, maybe a little lighter. Okay, so once you have that color, you can choose a brush. I like to start with brushes that are a little textured. And let's make this layer, color layer, in which we're gonna paint all the way at the bottom, so we don't cover up any of the sketch that we've created. And then you just, start making those strokes. And obviously I can see, okay, this is a little bit too dark. So I'll use my Control L for levels and then just make it slightly brighter. Like this, actually much more brighter. So now I have my color and I can go ahead and just paint it in. I'm not paying attention to if this color is going outside of the boundaries or covering parts of the sketch, because the beautiful thing about working in digital is that you can correct your errors as you go. I see this is a little bit too dark still, so I'll just make it slightly brighter. And you just go and paint in, and obviously as soon as you realize, okay, this is going out of boundaries and I want to fix that, well, we have tools for that. So we can go, let's say if you just don't pay attention and just draw it like this, right? All you have to do is press L, go to your polygonal lasso, and let's say you just want to have a very straight line. Just make a selection like this and press delete. And now you have a perfectly sketched out color like that. So that's one way of picking color, and that's the hardest way, because then you have to really pay attention to what kind of colors you're picking and how you're mixing them. And it's going to be much harder, but much more rewarding to create something that has a realistic color palette. It will require a lot of practice. And for creation, when you create for yourself, when you're learning, that's the best way to figure out colors. Or obviously go outside if you can do that, if you have hardware, whether it's a laptop with tablet or an iPad or any other maybe Cintiq, the Cintiq Companion, or any other hardware that will allow you to paint digitally outside. Obviously that's probably the best way to paint, because then you really have to pay attention to colors that are really natural. You're not looking at photography, you're not looking at a monitor that is displaying the photography to you. You're looking at the natural light that is emanating from the nature, and it's allowing you to see exactly the colors that supposed to be there. Now, if you look at photo, obviously we're trying to mimic nature here, but it's not going to be 100% accurate. So there's different levels of difficulty when it comes to that. Plein air is probably the most difficult way of painting, because it requires there is no cheating, if you will. You cannot just pick color. You have to come up with a color that you see. You cannot compare it until you actually paint it, and the screen itself will have a different values and will look slightly different even when you paint it from the nature. So it's a very challenging task. Now, if you paint from the photo, you can have it side by side like we have right here and compare it. Okay, this is too dark, this is too bright. What are we going to do here? Maybe I want to have a darker color, and maybe a little colder, or maybe warmer. I don't know. Let's see. Let's test it out. Make a new layer and paint the shadow. And I can see, okay, this shadow is obviously a little bit too cold. So I can go press Ctrl U and start finding the right value and the right color. And it looks to me like it's much warmer because of the global illumination. We have the column here that is reflecting a lot of light, and this light is casting this very yellowish tone on this pastel green. So obviously the shadow itself will become a little bit warmer. You can actually see the difference right here. There is a little bit of the blemish of a very sort of like colder version of this value, whereas here you can clearly see it's being lit by the bounce light. And right here in this corner you can see this is much warmer than this part, which has almost none of that bounce light. It's only picking light from the very blue sky that we have here. Alright, so that's one way of working, and this is going to be probably what I would like you to work with. But if it becomes too challenging and you want to have maybe more practice with observation and looking at photography and trying to figure out colors, this is another way of working that I prefer myself, because I'm already been working and painting for over a decade. And as for now, for me, all it matters is design and time challenge. So I do prefer working that way, and the way I'm discussing here is picking color directly from a photography, which is going to be the easiest way. In order to pick the color from the photography, all you have to do is press Alt. You're gonna have this little color picker icon, and then just click, and now we have a correct color. And as you see, apparently this is much darker than I thought it is. So why? Because there's a lot of different values and hues all around it, which make this seem to be very bright. So if we even go right here, you can actually see that from here there might be actually a darker pixel, and certainly is, because it's very closer to the shade. But here, right here in this area, it's the brightest part of that wall. We can see it's actually much warmer than I thought it is. So this is probably the color, and that's exactly the color you would have to pick. And then I want to do want to have that roundness, right? So I'll pick this color right here, and then just start painting it in, and pick it from here and painting it in, and maybe use a different brush that is more organic looking, make it larger. This is probably too hard, so I want to make something that is not too hard on the edges, like this brush right here, and just paint in that color. There we go. So you just make the brush strokes like this, and that's pretty much how you would block in colors. So we start with something that we know we see, and then just borrow from there. And as I'm here and I want to have a better blending, there's two ways of blend those colors together. Obviously blending them together will mean that what we're doing is creating shading and whatnot, but for now what I would do is pick a color in between and then do the brush stroke, and then pick a color and do a brush stroke. So all I need to do obviously is disable the the little layer that we have here, which is for perspective, which is a blue color, because otherwise I might pick that blue color from the sketch itself. And you just paint in what you need to paint in. All right, so we have like you know, a representation of what this column would look like, and then you can just continue and add it elsewhere. So we would just, oops, there we go. I'm actually gonna zoom out because I'm really not keep paying attention to detail right now. What I'm doing is I want to have a block of colors right here. So I'm just gonna make brush strokes that pretty much fill out more or less what my layers have to look like. And again, I'm not paying attention to how accurate my brush strokes are. All I care about is, you know, having those colors in my painting in the first place. So there we go. So we have parts of the wall, and we can pretty much populate the way it looks. I'm gonna add like a little shadow here. I want to make it look like there is a shadow here being cast. And then again, we go back to this color and populate the rest of it like this. So I'm leaving some empty areas, as you can see, and those empty areas are left there because I know that I'm gonna have some of the trees and tree branches and all that. So this is pretty much what you would do for the first 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes of your sketching, where you just pick colors and populate the image. So this is exactly what we're gonna do. But before we do that, we want you to pay attention to one thing that I'm doing here, which is suggesting a very different hue and making it, you know, making a little brush strokes here and there, which is creating those little blemishes in my paint. And the reason I'm doing this is because I don't want to have a perfectly uniform hue. I want to have hue that is changing, that is not being exact everywhere. The reason for it is because if you have a perfectly uniform hue, the things that you look at will start to look very unnatural. If we zoom in right here to this image, you can see that there are little blemishes that happen in that paint. There is a little discoloration in value. You can see that there's discoloration in hue as well in here. So there's the paint itself is not even. The surface of this paint is not even at all. It's catching the light in a different way. It's bouncing the light in a different way on almost every inch of that structure. So obviously we're not gonna go in and paint all those little dots in the sketch itself. It just doesn't make sense. But when you look closely, look how different the hues are. And we'll just take a color picker, look at the ring of color picker, the top part, how it's changing the hue from this green right here to this more of a desaturated green in here. How it's changing, where it's in here it's more saturated towards yellowish tones, and as we go further away, you can see that, you know, the hues are still changing. Now you can see there's a discoloration right here. This is basically because of the lens itself having a chromatic aberration. So when you paint, you have to disregard those discoloration on edges. Normally, when you see an edge that is really red like this, it's basically because of the lens and how the lens works, but it might also be because of the subsurface scattering of the material. In terms of the wall itself, the subsurface scatter would not be as harsh as you can see here, especially when you see the pattern where the redness is only appearing on one edge where the other edge is more greenish. That means that's the lens error. If the red color would be on both ends, that would probably mean it's a subsurface scattering. So pay attention when you examine your photo into those small details. That's how you have to pay attention. And you just cannot disregard this, because if you just pick this color and paint it like this, obviously what you're going to achieve is maybe a realism of photography, but it's not going to be a realism of a nature, and it just might look actually weird if you do it in a wrong way. So try avoid that. pay attention where it's if it's on both ends or both sides of those shadows. That means a subsurface scattering, which means the light is penetrating the inner parts of the paint or of the material, and it's scattering within and coming back and bleeding in the light even in the shadowy area. So this is not a case here, so we're just gonna ignore it, but I wanted to you to pay attention. And again, going back here, you can see the reflections of the gold on the wall itself, how this feels much colder when you can see this is much colder values and hues, whereas here it becomes almost yellow. And right here, yes, you can see a little bit of that redness coming in as well. So that's the global illumination. That's why global illumination is really important, because obviously this is the reality, this is how it looks in the reality, and when you add that effect to your painting where the objects surrounding your wall will actually do the global illumination, that's how you achieve the realism. So all right, so from here all we're gonna do next is we'll speed this up a little bit so I can finish painting in my hues and values, and from there we'll go and discuss how to integrate photography and details into this painting. So here we go, we're gonna work on values here and hues all together. This is probably not the fastest way of creating color images. The fastest obviously is using photography as a starting point and doing a set extension. That's something that matte painters actually do a lot when they work with footage. They create an extension to the footage, adding that extra detail that is needed, maybe changing the sky, expanding the buildings, and just making an illusion that the photo from which you start is integral part of something bigger that wasn't there in the beginning. So obviously that's the fastest way. But this is not what we're gonna do here. What we're doing here, we're actually working from colors and from hues and values all together, because not only it's a little harder to start that way, even though we're color picking for ease and for quickness, we're color picking from the photography that we already had a breakdown of what hues and values are actually used in that photo. We have the hero reference. So it's easier that way. However, when you have to block everything with hues and you have to put those hues together and create a cohesive image, it's not as easy as it sounds, even with color picking, because you have to add those colors to a construction that you've created before. That's why having a sketch, black and white, quick dribble, quick scribble on a screen where you can actually see a little bit of the construction and perspective, it's making the whole work much easier. But once you get really versed with that way of working, this is a step that you can absolutely skip, because you'll understand, okay, I know where my perspective is, I know how many points of perspective I want to use, and because I'm sketching, I don't have to be 100% precise, so I can just experiment and do something that looks great. So you don't have to have that sketch, you don't have to have perspective lines, as long as you understand those and you've been doing enough practice so you can skip and work just from hues, or starting just from hues and values. And later down the road, you'll actually realize that this kind of practice will allow you to skip another step, which is doing the sketch and then doing actually the block out of the hues. You might actually start mixing things together much faster than just trying to do sort of the construction just from colors and then from there integrating photos. You will find yourself that you're doing everything at once. You might find yourself starting with just values and then applying colors to those values. You might find yourself mixing a black and white color or whatever kind of sketch you have with photography, or collaging a couple of photos together just to get a sense of what you want, and then doing all the changes with overpaints and whatnot. However, if you start with just the hues and values in the beginning, you can guarantee yourself that you're going to have 100% control over what you do, so you're not going to be confined with the imagery that you're using in order to add details and fidelity to your final concept art. So that's very important to know because it's a part of the practice that I personally have done for quite a few years. I've never shied away personally from using photography in my concept images because I was always evaluating the photography that I'm using. I was trying to find the right colors and trying to find the right values and colors and light direction and generally the feel, even at some point looking into things like what kind of camera or lens was used in that specific photography, and if that camera lens is exactly what I need for my specific concept, because camera lenses can bring very different results. So once we establish that, okay, we have our hues and we're working only with hues and values. There's another thing that I like to do is adding sort of this undercolor layer, which is usually what I do is either a complementary color that is being added is just a full layer gradiented as this one color. Sometimes you can actually go as far as even using a texture, like a rusty texture or something that has a very sort of different information, hue information to what you paint with, because what it's going to give you is that extra variety of hues when you paint over in your different layers. So you're gonna have your base layer which has a different color. It's almost as master painters or painters would do an underpaint layer, but this in this occasion is just much more simplistic. It's not as elaborated as in when you would work with, say, gouache or oils or any other traditional medium. Here is just adding the variety, because when you paint with the textured brushes, when you do your painting of hues with your textured brushes, what's going to happen, you're going to have a little bit of transparency here and there on your layers in which you're painting, and that transparency will allow some of the colors from the underlayer beam through in the pixels and create different variations of hues in your image. So that's important because what gives you is that extra variety that we spoke about when we were examining that photo of this of this hero reference from the real close-up. You could see the wall was not perfectly in one hue. There was wide variety of hue variations, and that's exactly what we want to do here when we are having that underlayer for those exactly same reasons, the hue variations in our painting. So once the structure of hues and values is sort of established in my image, I already have my sketch and I have my colors in there. What I like to do next is I like to work in a little bit of more details before I start adding a photography details. I like to have a structure of what exactly is going to happen in my image. Obviously, again, if I'm on the clock, I would probably skip that step and go straight into photography, because photography itself gives me already the detail that I need. Unless I want to have something that is specifically constructed and has a different construction and different looks to what my references are, then I would go straight to those references and use those references as textures for my image. However, if they are different, then I would construct it exactly the same way. I would go into details, work with my hues and values, and try to establish exactly what's going to happen in my image. So I would work as much as I can with the brushes and add those extra details, extra elements that might be missing in the image. Maybe start sculpting a little bit of what I really want to see there, whether it's where the shadows are being cast, or changing a structure of how the trees are going to look like, or maybe adding extra elements such as sculptures, painting some extra details here and there. Just generally anything that I feel that going to be in the final image, whether it's just in a sketch form or something that I plan to finish by just painting, because, for instance, what happens if you don't have a correct reference? That might happen quite a lot. If you don't have a correct reference to work with, you either have to be very creative in what kind of texture you use in order to create this very realistic look, or if you paint it, and if you get in the mood and get in the habit of painting a lot, what's going to happen is you will be able to pick colors and hues and values and the lighting direction and global illumination and everything we've learned so far in terms of how the lighting works and how colors are operating and how the light is bouncing around and everything like that. Applying this knowledge, this technical knowledge, into your skill set of drawing. Once you get in that habit of doing it, of drawing a lot, of painting a lot, you will be able to paint something just by looking at references of something that looks similar, but it's not necessarily the same thing. So for instance, when I'm looking at my sculptures that I'm painting, obviously I'm trying to mimic a little bit of what I see on the reference, but I'm also adding some touches of my own. For instance, those two columns gonna have those sort of knight-looking figures, almost like knights holding some kind of sword, or maybe those could be some other kinds of structures built out of gold. This is not on the reference that I see, and it doesn't have to be, because I know by looking at the reference how to construct it. I understand what exactly I want to see there, and practice allows me to get to a point where I don't have to just redraw exactly what I see, but rather reconstruct what I see into something else. Much like the exercise we've done in a lesson 1, where we would take a photo reference of some kind of element, building element, or a column or something like that, and deconstruct it into geometrical figures. Once you do that, then you know what the construction is, and then you paint it or draw it in the perspective from different angle. And that exercise alone allows you to deconstruct things that you see and construct them in a different way, and still retain the lighting and still retain the colors and texture information. Once you get to that habit and you know how to do it, it will be easier for you to take a photo of something that is not necessarily what you need exactly in your image, but be creative with it and take texture information, maybe recolor it a little, or maybe even just take a part of a texture. So imagine we're taking just a sculpture, the golden sculpture, and pasting it in at some point. What we could do is just paste it in and start reconstructing it based on the sketch we already had there. And that allows us to keep the fidelity of texture that we have, but also make it very unique and almost create something that is our own design, rather than just a copy of something that already exists there in the photo. So having that extra effort, putting that effort into painting, will allow you to get into that point. It obviously takes time, but it's a time worth spent. One thing you don't want to do is rely only on photography and textures, because you will run into problem where there are no photos for what you need to do. You might get a task when you work in the video games where the thing that you have to create is non-existent. It doesn't have any attachment to the reality. The project might be like a hard sci-fi, and you have to construct something that is not necessarily explained in a way that you could just grab a photo of something that it looks similar and just reconstruct it here and there, we have it done. I've run into projects like that where I would try to do that as a sort of a beginning point to see if that's gonna work at all, and usually I would just find myself in a spot where I would just have to redo everything. And that was sort of a learning lesson, and almost a epiphany that it was good that I've spent much time painting in my past, so I could first sketch out what I need to have in there, and then find solutions in terms of what material is used and all those things that, you know, normally you might be missing, and then find textures that would fill out those missing parts just to get that extra fidelity. You're not going to be able to do that if you don't know how to construct, if you don't know how to use values and hues and how to use colors. So that part of the exercise is really important. And even so, if you're already working in the industry and you've already been painting for quite a while, it's always good to go back just to paint. If you just use photography for your work, I personally done that quite a lot myself, where just because of the constraints of the project and how fast I would have to turn the work in, I would find myself just working a lot with photos, and then it's almost like forgetting how to paint. So always go back to those roots. All right, so the next thing that is kind of important I wanted to talk about here is introducing complementary colors. So far we worked mostly with analogous colors here, and the reason is because it's just a very simple image. I deliberately made the construction of my concept to not include any of the sky, even though I had a moment where I just wanted to try, maybe I should add a little bit of sky in the corner, but I've decided just to skip it after all. The reason for it is because I wanted to keep that analogous color construction in my concept. I wanted to make the concept to be very serene, very quiet. I used verticality of the image to create a harmony. Obviously, the best harmony achieved is usually with very horizontal images, which we'll, by the way, discuss a little later in terms of how to use those shapes in or horizontal lines or vertical lines in terms of creating tension. So verticality adds a little bit of tension, but it's not as aggressive as diagonal lines. But when you introduce verticality together with horizontal lines, it will just make your scenery a little bit more quiet and sincere. Also, adding those analogous colors will make the image sort of more pleasant to look onto. But it also takes away a little bit of contrast that you might need, especially if you want to introduce an element or parts of the construction that is supposed to be really important, or maybe lead your way towards something else, right? So in this occasion, I decided to introduce a complementary color. We have a lot of pastel and warm greens, so I've decided to introduce a red color because red is an obvious opposite color to the green. It sits directly on the opposite to the color ring. It's a complementary color for a green color, so it was a very simple choice. Red color, what it does here in this image, it allows me to pull your eye towards the entrance. It actually outlines directionality, where you're supposed to look. It tells you, okay, look into that black hole there, because that's where the entrance is, and that's what you're supposed to focus on. So that's the reason to use the complementary color in this image, and adding that red hue right in the center of the construction, also on the pathway to that entrance as well. Finally, another thing I've noticed while working on this sketch is the framing I've chosen in the very beginning. After applying hues and after applying hues together with saturation and together with values, what I've noticed is that the image became very narrow and very confined, meaning there was not enough breathing space, and it just became very packed. So the one thing that I like to do when I work in a sketch mode is reframing my images and finding the balance in composition, and finding the balance of how much space do I really need in my sketch so that it doesn't feel very narrow or confined, and how much of the detail that has to be added later on Um, one great thing about keeping your work in layers and maybe collapsing some of the layers for clarity is the fact that you can, once you recrop the image, so you use your crop tool and just change the aspect ratio, or maybe add a little bit of inches on each of the side, and maybe a little bit of top or maybe bottom, depending on how you want to reframe your image, is the fact that you can use the marquee tools and can use transformation tools to stretch the layers that you have and avoid a situation where you have to do a lot of paint in. Obviously, it's not something that can be fully avoided. In my situation here in this sketch, I actually had to reframe some of the layers, basically stretch some of the layers and add that extra layer of paint in order to fill out the missing pixels after reframing. The biggest challenge obviously was trees, because I've spent a little bit of time on sketching the shape of the trees and sketching the shadows and whatnot. Walls were pretty easy because it's just adding the same hue and value that already exists in the image, so it's pretty straightforward. However, shadows of the trees, the shape of the shadows, as well as the shape of the trees themselves, actually needed a little extra work, because what I've noticed is once you reframe something, you start to see that elements that you've added before might not necessarily look that great and might actually make an illusion that something is out of perspective. This is something I've noticed with my trees. Once I started adding that missing detail and pixels that were outside of the frame before, once I started populating that area, I've noticed that there's a slight imbalance between left and right. One of the tree was feeling like it's very close and it's obscuring quite a lot of the construction, while the other tree was sort of pushed away, and it just created this weird imbalance. So I just needed to work on that for a little. I needed to take the trees and start changing their sizes and putting maybe extra detail here and there. So that's something you will run into when you reconstruct your image and you start to add those details and reframe. You will find that some of the layers are not necessarily working that well, and you might need to paint them over again. So for instance, again, rebalancing the way the trees look, rebalancing how much actually shadow is being cast underneath the tree, and like where is the light direction coming from, and how it's going to affect the look of the tree, how much of the shadow will be in the canopy, and how much of the light the canopy will actually catch. And then figuring out, okay, how much extra of that I need to add, and where is the balance? Do I need to rescale? Can I keep it the way it is? And obviously I couldn't. And you can see that the right side, it was just too light. There was not enough canopy, and it just became very imbalanced. So I had to sort of reframe and restructure that balance. And the left was too heavy, so I had to move it away a little bit and then paint in the shadow. So it's a little extra work, but here's the thing. We're working just with hues and values. We're using custom brushes, so we're not really paying that much attention into details. And that's great because it's a fast way of working, even though the construction of this concept is taking time, obviously, right? If you would work with photos and you would want to cut the part of a tree and move it around, what would happen is that you would find that some parts of the photo are missing, and it's a big hole because the photo has its own fidelity already. It has quite a lot of details. It has quite a lot of information that you're starving for if you want to create a realistic image. However, if you start editing the photo a lot and doing paint overs, you will it starts to chip away the quality of your overall painting, of your overall concept, because you will now all of a sudden have an imbalance between really fleshed out realistic parts of the painting and then brush strokes that can are clearly visible to your eye and are really contrasting in terms of how much attention to detail they have. So changing and elaborating upon photography, it's much harder actually. And finally, the last thing that I needed to add is figures, some kind of characters, whether it's for just the story element. Obviously, story element has always a meaning in concept art, whether it's just showing a construction or doing a specific shot for a cinematic. One element about adding characters is that it allows you to understand the scale of what you have in your frame on your canvas. If you have a character, then you can tell how big it is. If you don't have a character, there's quite a lot room for imagination, which can be confusing when you start applying textures and when you start adding details, because details will matter a lot when you have scale in the consideration. For instance, after adding those figures, what I've started to notice is a very simple thing. My trees look humongous, and I needed to change the way they are structured. So having characters built in, just doing a really rough sketch of what those figures are, and sort of suggesting, okay, this could be some kind of university, like a futuristic, almost Final Fantasy-esque futuristic university where everyone is wearing the same uniform. Maybe it could be some kind of temple. There's a lot of opportunities here in terms of storytelling, but the one thing that was pretty obvious right away after I added characters is that the trees are way too large in scale, and the shape of the tree suggested that the leaves would be huge, almost half of the body or head size. That would be just one leaf. So I had to restructure the way the trees looked like. I had to choose a different type of tree, if you will, or change the scale, make the trees to be essentially larger and older, but change the shape of the canopy to be more rounded, and suggest the scale of the leaves to be much smaller. So the branches themselves were too big. I had to scale them down, which meant I need to add more shadows and more variations and contrast between shadow and light. So every element you add and every element you work with in your painting will throw your final image off balance, and it's a matter of spotting those off balance moments and acting on them. And that's exactly what I was doing here when I was changing those trees. All right, so the next thing is working on details. And now working on details can be, time consuming, but I tried to restrict myself in around 2 hours. And at the end of it, I'll show you little cool tricks that you can do in order to make your illustration or your concept look more illustrative and hide some of that texture detail that we're gonna work on. All right, so I'm taking my reference photo here. I'm doing a selection, duplicating with Control J, and then going in and taking blues and making them as bright as possible with Control U, which is hue saturation, and then Control L, which goes for levels. And then from there, I'm desaturating that layer and taking red colors and yellows as well as greens all the way down in lightness to the dark color, as dark as possible. I want to have the highest possible contrast there. And I will adjust it as much as I can until it gets very, very black and white almost. And then I go to channels and blue channel. I right click blue channel to create a selection mask. Or control click, then inverse selection and duplicate. And what happens is, what it does, it removes all the pixels that were white and keeps the pixels that were dark. And what you see right here is a sort of semi-good mask for the tree itself. It's not perfect, but I don't need the perfection here. What I wanted is to have the texture of the tree itself, because I'm gonna do heavy overpaint. So from that point on, once I have my structure that I've copied from the photo itself, I'm not actually copying all the photo. I'm just copying that part that has the shadows in it, and basically creating a fake sort of illusion of shadows, and then painting my canopy with just brushed textures. Now I'm using clipping masks, and I'm clipping basically that layer to the base layer, and that layer, exactly what I'm going to do for quite a while now, is I'm going to clean up a lot of that tree layer. I'm going to make sure that the outline of the tree is more precise, and I'm gonna work on shadows and shading. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking at my reference that I have next to me, and also have a bunch of references always available on my second screen. And those are basically the references of trees. And I look at trees and just try to dissect how exactly the tree shadow and light is in play, how the canopy is formed, and how exactly it's going to look when I start painting it. So for this, I'm just gonna speed up this process, because everything we do here is pretty much repeating everything we've done so far, which is painting with texture brushes. And the way I'm painting it is basically trying to imagine each brush stroke to be a part of the canopy, whether it's separate leaves or maybe like a branch full of leaves. I'm just trying to sort of painterly assess the whole situation and start adding those details. And what I'm also doing is using my clone stamp, which we already talked about, and basically cloning that layer here and there, adding more details and just painting. The way I'm gonna work with this generally is add layers to add that painterly look to it, and work basically from the same premise all across, which is having my shadows being really dark, still kind of keeping the same values and hues that are already existing in the dark areas of the tree already, and then paint shadows being casted by the canopy, paint light that goes through and hit the leaves and becomes a brighter part of the canopy, and outline that shadow by a contrast of the brightness and the shadows themselves. That always create a very interesting results, a results that speak for three-dimensionality of the whole image, or that part of the image specifically. And I generally like to work that way. I think about what I paint in 3 dimensions, even though we're only working on the very flat canvas. I always consider the canvas to be 3-dimensional in my head. Basically, the idea is I want to construct what I see, and even though I'm not doing construction lines like we've been doing it so far, I'm pretty much using the method of thinking about constructing the image. So I'm imagining those boxes. I'm imagining how the canopy would be split into those boxes, and then paint where the shadow would be, based on the light direction that we have, where the light will be, where will be the shadow, how the shadow is going to be cast on the other parts of the canopy. You can pretty much break down your whole scene into very small, or rather very simple elements, very simple geometrical elements. And as long as you do that, you will have a better understanding on what's going on in your picture. And better understanding on how to work with the 3-dimensionality. What I would suggest personally is work with reference and look at the reference, and the reference will tell you exactly what's the structure of the tree, especially like when you're painting trees. Trees are a very complicated thing to do. One thing that I want you to avoid is painting every single leaf, because that's not gonna work. So think about clusters of value and clusters of hues. That's exactly how I work. I'm only painting very specific small leaves on the corners, on the areas where there's a lot of contrast, where I want specifically expose the fact that you can see individual leaves. But when you look at the canopy, when you look at the tree itself, unless you're really looking into details, normally what you see is clusters of color, or larger parts of branches. You're not examining every single leaf. You're thinking, it's almost thinking of blocks of colors, of blocks of value and hues. And that's the best way to approach this kind of work, where there's a lot of details that is involved in the tree. And the way to approach it is to approach it from that point of view, not individual, but clusters. Once the clusters are there, then add a little bit of detail here and there. It doesn't have to be detailed all across, because you're just gonna work on this forever unless you use photo texture, which will allow you to get the details really, really quickly. The problem that will occur is that it will look like a photo texture, and if the rest of the image is very painterly, it's going to be an issue. So that's how I would approach it, and I would strongly advise to approach it this way, especially when you want to have that painterly feel in your image. Right after that, I'm basically trying to construct the whole parts of the details in the image. So I'm looking and examining where I'm lacking contrast between lines. And the biggest lack of contrast is right now how those shapes are formed, how those columns that are forming the entrance, how is the separation between them and the ground, and the separation between the facade or the very bottom, the foundation, which is suggested to be built of stone, and the difference of it between the ground layer, where you can clearly see the ground, how the shadow is being cast, if the shadow is hard or soft, if the shadow on the ground is aligning the shadow on the wall, and all the discolorations of the stone, the color of the golden sort of stripe that goes all across. All those things need a clear separation. What I like to do when I work on that is make sure that the lines in between are sharp, but also to make my process much easier and faster, I tend to copy and paste the same texture and then edit it, because what happens is in an instance of that golden stripe, when I copy and paste and then just do little edits, I'm getting good results. Next thing is obviously shadows, the shadows that comes from the tree. Ideally, because we already have a canopy, just copy that layer and make a selection, and then use from that, just work with that selection that you have, because it's going to have a perfect representation of what the shadow of the tree is. You have to remember though, the form itself, the form of the building, will affect the way the shadow is being cast. How close is the shadow to the actual tree versus how far it is if the form of the building is changing. And then jumping into the statues, you probably remember I've spoke about it earlier in this video, that those statues would be a different thing from what we see on the original reference that is pulled up right next to this painting. But it's gonna have the same essence and feel to it, the same colors, and basically it feels like it's made of gold, and it's very, very intricate, very detailed, but yet not too monumental. So that's what I wanted to do here. I used the detail from the photography of a Rococo construction. But what I do is I always overpaint those things. Again, by just examining the canopy, you can see that I'm trying to keep sort of a painterly feel to the whole image. And basically, in order to do that, I need to make sure that everything is very similar in a way. So there's nothing that stands out completely. And I always gonna work for my image and with my image that way. I'm gonna make sure I examine every part of the image. Whenever I add photo texture, I'll blend it with my painting by painting over that texture. So paste in, make a selection, paste in that part of the texture that you like, and then extend it with the brushes, the custom brushes. Work your way down, construct everything else that is in the scene. And from there, you can pretty much have a very good results. You're gonna get a results that will allow you to make your painting look concise, look like it's blending together nicely. One thing I want you to avoid, and one thing I highly recommend to avoid, is pasting a texture and then leaving it out there where you can clearly see seams, or maybe the texture is low res. Those things are always going to look ugly and will break the illusion of illustration. Even though we're working here in the realm of concept art, where the idea behind the image is more important than the aesthetics, especially because we're working in as a team effort, I want you to know that aesthetics do matter, because if aesthetics don't work in your image, what's going to happen is the image itself is just going to be not really pleasant to look at. And when the image is not pleasant to look at, the only person that will be able to evaluate your concepting skills and the idea behind is going to be another person that has that same artistic approach to art, or same understanding of art, which means a person that is not maybe well versed in art, in composition, perspective, colors, might not understand your intentions. And making a concept is not only making the functionality of the concept, but also selling and showing intentions of the concept. And if you can make an effort, spend time to build something that has that intentions, then obviously it's gonna sell better and look better and be more understandable compared to something that not necessarily looked out that as intentional, maybe is lacking the detail that would help to get the better understanding of what it is. So that's basically how I approach it. And there is obviously, a couple of other tricks that we'll talk about on how to use textures and all those things really matter. But basically in a stage like this where I already have my sketch and I'm working only on details, I always like to think about where the image needs that clarity, where it's lacking intentions, where I can make it better. And I always think about what's the focal point of the image, where your eyes is supposed to go. And to me, your eyes are supposed to travel through the road to the entrance and then up with that red stripe that goes vertically across the image. So in order to have that impression, because I've spent quite a lot of time in order to render those trees, I want to make sure that everything else is up to the par and basically at the same level of detail as the trees themselves, or even better, especially if my intention is to make this part of the image, the center part where the entrance is and how the entrance looks, if that is supposed to be the most intriguing and most interesting part of the picture, I'll spend as much time as I can in order to make that happen, in order to make this part to be as interesting as possible. So painting details, using photography to paste in details and then, overpaint them, create new layers to add more details. And then basically everything that I see in the photography and I examine in photography, if something doesn't specifically work to my image, I'll fix it, but examine how it works, where the shadows are being cast. So that little window you see up there, that's exactly what I did. I used a similar structure that I see in the window from the reference, but I didn't like the window in the reference to be that bright. So I had to make the selection, make it darker, and then paint in those golden metal looking parts, and then paint it on the different layer, and then use different layer to add shadows and all that. So it's always finding the right balance of where the design works with the image and where I want to change something, what's the scale, because the window itself was too small. Like it felt it's not the right scale, especially when you look at the characters. So something to avoid and something to work with. Finally, as the final touches is just kind of going through the whole image. Once I have all my details that I wanted there to be fleshed out, I'm just looking at the areas that may still be lacking details and maybe organize those areas to have a little bit of what's missing. So for instance, that the whole center part where you see that white stripe that I'm painting right now with those circular painted fresco looking elements, this detail will add a little extra attention. It's also going to break the way the gate itself is presenting. It will make a separation between the top and the bottom and force your focus towards the bottom a little bit more. Without it, your eyes would just slide across all the way up, and this is sort of like a stopping point for me where you're supposed to stop and look at the entrance itself. The top part is still going to be interesting. Your eyes will eventually travel there, but I wanted to make that separation. And I really liked what I saw in this original hero reference. This hero reference basically provided me almost all the textures that I needed for this image to be completed. And I really didn't need more than that. Every single color information is there. The lighting information is very similar, if not identical, but the whole structure of the image, the concept of the image is completely different. And that's basically what it's making for a concept art, you want to make your life as easy as possible, but yet still make an image to be impressive and intentional, and also serve the function, which is concept, right? It's supposed to work as not only as inspiration for the team, especially if it's a pre-production concept art, then yeah, it's definitely an inspirational piece for the team. If it's a production concept art, it's going to be less focused on details and more focused on the actual functionality. But basically, in this kind of work, this is probably more of an inspirational piece, or maybe sort of like a production painting, where you give yourself a little more time to paint something that is more detailed, that is constructing the way the textures might look, not only just the construction itself, but also how the lighting presents itself, and where it's lacking details, and maybe what can be added there, how this image can be even more and more interesting. And if that's the idea behind it, when I want to work with colors, I'll make sure that every part of the image is having the amount of detail that I would expect to be there. I want the image to be uniform in the amount of detail. I don't want to have areas where the detail is lacking. Obviously, you cannot spend too much time in one area and then leave other areas untouched, because that's going to create this unbalanced composition almost. Remember that details create contrast. And when the contrast appears on the image, it's going to drag your eye towards that place. So my main focus in it is having as much detail as I can in the center of the image, but also simplification of other parts of the image, but also making sure that every part is basically having enough detail, so it's not looking like an unfinished part. That's another thing that I really want to avoid. I don't want to have parts which look just sketched out and unfinished, especially when you start mixing photography. So that's very important. If you're mixing photography with the painting, don't leave parts that are very sketchy and then leave parts that are almost like photo bashed together, because what's going to happen is the contrast between the details will be distracting and will create it will actually break the illusion of a finished and refined image. Even though it might take you a little extra time to do those brush strokes and do little discolorations here and there, all of those things that you see I do are basically based from what I see from the reference and how I feel it should be painted. But basically all those ideas used here, the attention to detail that I give myself here in this image is for the reason of clarity and intention. So in this kind of work, this is exactly what I would focus on, and this is how I would imagine you would work your way up from the sketch that we started with to a more finalized illustration like this. And finally, before we jump into a couple of tricks that I want to show you, what can be done in real time, what can be done with the image to make it more sort of bound together, so there's no elements that are sticking out too much, and maybe it feels more of more as a background, almost like a background painting for the anime, rather than a photorealistic concept art. I wanted to express one more thing. I always gonna find and examine my image where I can add a little extra clarity and a little more line. So for instance, that ledge of that ledge that goes horizontally across the image, I want to make sure that this part of the image is very nice and fleshed out. The little bit of that nice sculpture that we see in the center and the sculpture on the sides, I want to make sure that little brush strokes where I go in and work on details is going to add more value to it and more of interest to it. And finally, the characters. Even though the characters are only built for scale here, and you can see they're painted, and I'm kind of making it a little trick that I'm only using 2 or 3 values and outline them almost to make them feel like it could be an animated part of the picture. It's almost sort of like this artistic choice and illusion that I'm trying to add here. I want to make sure that they have enough detail too. I don't want them to look too sketchy, because if we have this very nicely rendered image and with a lot of details, a lot of painted and even textured details, the last thing you want to have again is something that just looks unfinished. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do here, making sure that all parts of my image don't look that way. So whether it's characters or again going in, painting that little small details that are only visible when you zoom in, all those things will make for the clarity of the image. Will add that extra layer of clarity, extra layer of read that will help with the intention. The concept is already there. We understand the concept. We understand exactly what this image is representing. Now it's just adding that little extra touch, that little extra effort that will make the image better. Okay, so the trick I wanted to talk about that will make this image feel more illustrative, and it's actually not an expensive thing to do, it actually takes very little time, is something that goes with blur. And there's one kind of blur that we haven't discussed. When you go to filters, blur, surface blur, that's the blur that I want to use on this image, and this is how I'm going to use this blur in this particular illustration. So right now we have quite a few layers, and in order for this blur to work, I want to make sure that I'm blurring everything. And the way to do it is either collapse everything to a single layer, which we don't want to do because we still want to keep control over what we want to do with this image later, or merge every single layer into one layer that will be on top of the stack. And in order to do that, you have to press Control, Alt, Shift, and E, which will basically create a layer of what you see on the canvas and basically merge everything that is underneath that layer right here all the way down to the bottom of the layer. Now you want to make sure that when you do that, you're having your top layer selected and the layers above it are either disabled or there are nothing above that layer specifically. Let's see what happens if we don't do that. Let's select this layer. We have 3 layers above it, the characters, a little bit of that details with the canopy and you know, grass and bushes that are down here, and also I believe that's actually an empty layer, so we can actually disable it. But we have those 2 layers, and let's say we have that 3 layers here. So let's select this and press Control, Shift, Alt, and E. And what's going to happen is all of a sudden you can see that we have those layers still on top of it, and it's merging everything that we saw, including characters. So those characters become obsolete, but what happens is pay attention to those details right here, to the ground shadow. Even though we haven't fleshed it out, if you had something on opacity, it will actually duplicate the opacity and it might create the results that you don't want to have. So I really encourage not to do that, especially when you look here on the canopy. You can see that all of a sudden there's more of the brush strokes that might not be desired. Some of the details become too fleshed out. It's just not a good practice. So I want to avoid that. So what I'll do is I'll turn my layers back on. I will select the top layer, the last layer that has that opacity on, or it's actually visible. The visibility of the layer is actually right here. That little eye icon that you can see here will determine if the layer is visible or not. And if you click that icon, you can actually disable the layer. All right, so I have it selected, Control, Shift, Alt, and E, and we have our layer. What I also like to do when I do that, because sometimes you might do a filter or something that you're sort of semi-happy with, and then you want to do more operations that are similar or maybe else, but you don't want to be in the process of like, I've created this layer and then I have to do it again and whatnot. So what I will do is, having this layer selected, Control J to duplicate it, and now I'm ready to use that filter. So let's go to Blur, Filter, Blur, and Surface Blur. And now we have 2 options here. We have Threshold and Radius. And what I generally do is I play with those settings, and because the way it works, it actually shows you how it's going to look in the preview right here in the image. So you can see if we increase the threshold, the image becomes much more blurry. We're actually losing the definition between the shapes. It becomes very blurry. Radius is basically, so there's two options here. So threshold is basically determining how much of the contrast and how much of the lines in between the value contrast and hue contrast is going to be kept. So if you increase the threshold to really high levels, and let's increase the radius to really high levels, so we can actually see what's going on. You see we're actually losing all the detail almost. And as you go and decrease the threshold, you see that it suddenly starts to preserve. Let's just let it load for a second. Obviously it's just calculating completely. It's starting to preserve some of that detail. We start with the characters here, and if we go even lower to like 69 or 49, you can see the characters are much more preserved, and you start to see that line that has the highest contrast is becoming sharp. There's a little bit of blurriness here going on, but it's still very sharp. If you go all the way down, let's say to 9, for instance, you can see we're keeping all the details here, but what's getting blurred is the detail that we see right here. So when we zoom in, you can see that this detail on the zoom becomes very blurred. So the noise threshold, or the noise in that textures that we see here, is becoming blurred and sort of fade away. And I actually like how it's working the image, because that's the basic idea behind this blur. Now you have to control the radius. The radius will actually control how much of the blur is going to happen. So the radius works exactly like if you would work with the Gaussian blur or any other blur, which means how much of the blurriness you're gonna see. You know, the smaller the radius, the less blurred that part of the image is going to be. So the threshold controls how much of the lines between values and hues are preserved, and the radius is controlling how much of the blur will going to happen with that constraint of those of the threshold. So I would say I'm gonna try something like maybe threshold of 6 and the blurriness of let's try with 35 just for now. 35 and press OK. It's gonna calculate for a second. All right, it's done. So now we can see what happened to the image, and we can actually click on and off, and you can see we're actually losing a little bit of detail here, but that might be actually a good idea. Some of the details here are a little bit too sloppy, a little bit too sort of it looks like it's a mix of different values, and it might be intentional, but I'm not necessarily super happy with it. But there's also details that I would like to keep, especially on that wall that now becomes very flat. So I don't want to have that. But I do like what's happening, for instance, on the tree canopy, which is basically a little bit of that flatness that starts to creep in. So because it's killing details, it's blurring out details that are very low on contrast and very low on the hues contrast and on values contrast, which allows me to make this look more as a painting or a painted illustration rather than a collage of photo textures that were blended together. So that's one of the reasons and one of the ways I would use that blur specifically to get that effect of this sort of painted illustration. So from here, what I'm going to do is create a mask exactly as we used to do before, and select eraser, and then select one of those custom brushes we have here, make it bigger, and then start erasing in. So I want to make sure that I'm erasing with the black color, so the black color has to be here on the bottom of selection. From those two colors on this swatch here, the bottom one, the background color, is what's going to erase. So I want to erase those areas that I wanted to have that little detail preserved. So we can see that we're killing that detail that was here intentionally, but we're preserving some of that detail that's in those areas that I really liked it to be there. So maybe a little bit of here on the bottom could stay. Let's see and examine the image a little more, see where we could use some of that detail. Maybe right here on those areas behind the tree. But otherwise I'm pretty happy with the results. So I will not go too far with the eraser itself. Maybe some of those bushes right here could use that, you know, a little bit of detail that we had there. All right, so that's pretty much the trick that I would use, and actually gives us a nice look to it. It feels like you know, it's more of an illustration, more of like a almost like watercolor, or maybe, you know, painted, rather than a textured thing. You could actually experiment and even go as far as, let's say I duplicate this layer and disable this one, so whatever changes we're gonna do here is not gonna be permanent, and I don't have to go to history, and I can actually control and see which of the changes are working better. So I'm gonna press Control F, which basically what it does, it's repeating the last filter used. So when you go to filters, you can see we used surface blur. It's here in the history, and it shows us, okay, this is the filter right here. So Control F, and let's see how it's gonna look when it's blurred once again. So maybe it's not working that well anymore, you know, so it's a nice test to have. I'm not entirely convinced that this is the right direction, so I'm just gonna delete that layer, and I think I'm just gonna keep it the way it is for now. So this is it. This is the simple trick that I use for illustrations that are supposed to look very illustrative. And from here, it's, you know, you can go as far as say it's finished, or even just go zoom in and say, huh, maybe I want to keep like doing a little bit of detail work here and there. So those branches right here, maybe we could use some extra effort. Let's just zoom in and do exactly what we did so far when we were having this video sped up. It's just basically coming in, picking color from whatever we see already in the canvas, and just kind of adding that little extra layer of attention that will make it more blended together, and it will make it feel like it's, you know, it's more of a painted image rather than a collage of weird textures that are not merged in the right way. And, you know, all of those things matter. Again, it's a matter of intention and a matter of readability. So maybe some of parts could just use a little bit of that extra effort that we're creating here. You don't have to go too far. It's all of the, you know, you can always stop. This image is already pretty good, so we just don't have to do too much work. What I'm doing is just I'm making sure that everything sort of fits together nicely, and I'm not having any areas that are disappointing to me. I want to make sure that I'm pretty happy with generally majority of the image here. So this is exactly what I'm doing, just adding a little bit of that nice painterly feel, and I'm pretty much ready to wrap it up. So just a few more brush strokes right here, and I think this is good enough. So this is it. This is the final image from this lesson. We pretty much covered how to work with colors and how to integrate textures into it. This is a very mild texture integration because the majority of the textures are being overpainted, and the clarity of this image comes from what kind of colors are being picked and what kind of lighting direction is being used. I want you to get used to the idea of working with a hero reference. Whether your hero reference is what you see with your naked eyes when you're on the plein air and you're painting from the nature, or if you're using photo reference to paint, pay attention to color and details, pay attention to the light direction, pay attention how the light is reflecting on the surfaces, how the shadows work, because that's exactly how you will build a confidence in yourself to paint with colors. Also take into consideration everything you've learned so far in other lessons, which is deconstructing what you see into geometrical shapes. Think about geometry, think about perspective, think about all those things we've learned, the foundation of itself, because the more attention you pay to those aspects, the better the final result is going to be. And the more you practice it that way, the easier it will become for you. And eventually you will not even have to think about those things because it will just be in your blood. Your brain will exactly know how to process the images that you see and deconstruct it by itself. You will not have to think about those geometrical figures. You will not have to think about perspective. Everything will be already in your head, calculated and ready to go. So keep practicing, and let's move on to the homework assignments and takeaways. The homework assignment for this lesson is going to be very straightforward. We'll use techniques that we've learned from this lesson, as well as the theory of colors and the theory of how materials work together from this lesson, and apply it to our work. We'll use exactly the same techniques that I've discussed